Part 5, Lightness and Weight. 1. When Teresa unexpectedly came to visit Tomas in Prague, he made love to her, as I pointed out in Part 1, that very day, or rather the very hour, but suddenly thereafter she became feverish. As she lay in his bed and he stood over her, he had the irrepressible feeling that she was a child who had been put in a bulrush basket and sent downstream to him. The image of the abandoned child had consequently become dear to him, and he often reflected on the ancient myths in which it occurred. It was apparently with this in mind that he picked up a translation of Sophocles' Oedipus. The story of Oedipus is well known. Abandoned as an infant, he was taken to King Polybus, who raised him. One day when he had grown into a youth, he came upon a dignitary riding along a mountain path. A quarrel arose, and Oedipus killed the dignitary. Later he became the husband of Queen Jocasta, the ruler of Thebes. Little did he know the man he had killed in the mountains was his father, and the woman with whom he slept his mother. In the meantime, fate visited a plague on his subjects and tortured them with great pestilences. When Oedipus realized he himself was the cause of their suffering, he put out his own eyes and wandered blind away from Thebes. 2. Anyone who thinks that the communist regimes of Central Europe are exclusively the work of criminals is overlooking a basic truth. The criminal regimes were not made by criminals, but enthusiasts and convinced they had discovered the only road to paradise. They defended the road so valiantly that they think they were forced to execute many people. Later it became clear that there is no paradise. The enthusiasts were therefore murderers. Then everyone took to shouting at the communists, "You're the ones responsible for our country's misfortunes. It had grown poor and desolate for its loss of independence, and it had fallen into the hands of the Russians for its judicial murders." And the accused responded, "We don't know. We were deceived. We were true believers. Deep in our hearts we are innocent." In the end, the dispute narrowed down to a single question. Did they really not know, or were they merely making believe? Tomas followed the dispute closely, as did his 10 million fellow Czechs, and was of the opinion that while there had definitely been communists who were not completely unaware of the atrocities, they could not have been ignorant of the horrors that had been perpetuated, and were still being perpetuated in the pre-revolutionary Russia. It was probable that the majority of the communists had not, in fact, known of them. But he said of himself, whether they knew or they didn't know was not the main issue. The main issue is whether a woman was innocent because he didn't know. Is a fool on the throne relieved of all responsibility merely because he is a fool? Let us concede that a Czech Republic prosecutor in the early 50s who called for the death of an innocent man was deceived by the Russian secret police and the government of his own country. By now that we know that all the accusations to have been absurd and the executed to have been innocent, how can the self-same public prosecutor defend his purity of heart by beating himself on the chest and proclaiming, "My conscience is clear. I didn't know. I was a believer." Isn't this? I didn't know. I was a believer. At the very root of this irreparable guilt. It was in this connection that Tomas recalled the tale of Oedipus. Oedipus did not know that he was sleeping with his own mother, yet when he realized what had happened, he did not feel innocent. Unable to stand the sight of the misfortune brought by not knowing, he put out his eyes and wandered blind from Thebes. When Tomas heard the communists shouting in defense of their inner purity, he said to himself, as a result of your not knowing, the country has lost its freedom, lost it for centuries perhaps, but you shout that you feel no guilt. How can you stand the sight of what you've done? How is it that you aren't horrified? Have you no eyes to see? If you had eyes, you would have put them out and wander away from Thebes. The analogy so pleased him that he often used it in conversation with friends, and his formulation grew increasingly precise and elegant. Like all intellectuals at the time, he read a weekly newspaper published in the 300,000 copies by the Union of Czech Writers. It was a paper that achieved considerable autonomy within the regime and dealt with issues forbidden to others. Consequently, it was the writer's paper that raised the issue of who bore the burden of guilt for the judicial murders resulting from political trials that marked the early years of the communist power. Even the writer's paper merely repeated the same question: did they know or did they not? Because Tomas found this question second-rate, he sat down one day, wrote down his reflections on Oedipus, sent them to the weekly. A month later he received an answer, an invitation to the editorial offices. The editor who greeted him was short, but as straight as a ruler. He suggested that Tomas had changed the word in order in one of the sentences, and soon the text made its appearance on the next to the last page in the letters to the editor section. Tomas was overjoyed. They had considered it necessary to ask him to the editorial offices to approve the change in word order, but then without asking him shortened his text by so much that it was reduced to its basic thesis, making it too schematic and aggressive. He didn't like it anymore. All this happened in the spring of 1968. Alexander Dubček was in power along with those communists who felt guilty and were willing to do something about their guilt. But the other communists, the ones who kept shouting how innocent they were afraid that the enraged nation would bring them to justice. They complained daily to the Russian ambassador, trying to drum up support. When Tomas's letter appeared, they shouted, "See what things have come to! Now they're telling us publicly to put our eyes out." 2 or 3 months later, the Russians decided that the free speech was inadmissible in their gubernia, and in a single night they occupied Tomas's country with their army 3. When Tomas came back to Prague from Zurich, he took up in the hospital where he had left off. Then one day the chief surgeon called him in. "You know as well as I do that you're no writer or journalist or the savior of the nation. You're a doctor and a scientist. I would be very sad to lose you, and I'll do everything I can to keep you here, but you've got to retract the article you wrote about Oedipus. Is it terribly important to you?" "To tell you the truth," said Tomas, recalling how they had amputated a good third of the text, "it couldn't be any less important." "You know what's at stake," said the chief surgeon. He knew all right. There were 2 things in the balance: his honor, which consisted in his refusing to retract what he had said, and what he had come to call the meaning of his life, his work in medicine and research. The chief surgeon went on. "The pressure to make public retractions of the past statements. There's something medieval about it. What does it mean anyway, to retract what you've said? How can anyone state categorically that a thought that once had is no longer valid? In modern times the idea can be refuted, yes, but not retracted. And since to retract an idea is impossible, merely verbal, formal sorcery, I see no reason why you shouldn't do as they wish. In a society run by terror, no statements whatsoever can be taken seriously. They are all forced, and the duty of every honest man is to ignore them. Let me conclude by saying that it is my interest and in your patient's interest that you stay on here with us." "You're right, I'm sure," said Tomas, looking very unhappy, but the chief surgeon was trying to guess at his train of thought. "I'm afraid I'd be ashamed." "Ashamed? You mean to say you hold your colleagues in such high esteem that you care what they think?" "No, I don't hold them in high esteem," added Thomas. "Oh, by the way," the chief surgeon added, "you won't have to make a public statement. I have their assurance. They're bureaucrats. All they need is a note in their files to the effect that you have nothing against the regime. Then if someone comes and attacks you for letting the work of the hospital, you're covered. You're giving me my word that anything you say will remain between you and them. They have no intention of publishing a word of it. Give me a week to think it over," said Tomas, and there the matter rested. Or Tomas was considered the best surgeon in the hospital. Rumor had it that the chief surgeon, who was getting on towards the retirement age, would soon ask him to take over. What that rumor was supplemented by was the rumor that the authorities had requested a statement of self-criticism from him. No one doubted he would comply. That was the first thing that struck him. Although he had never given people cause to doubt his integrity, they were ready to bet on his dishonesty rather than on his virtue. The second thing that struck him was their reaction to the position they attributed to him. I might divide it into 2 basic types. First type of reaction came from people who themselves, they or their intimates, had retracted something, who had themselves been forced to make public peace with the occupation regime, or were prepared to do so unwillingly. Of course, no one wanted to do it. These people began to smile, a curious smile at him, a smile that he had never seen before, the sheepish smile of secret conspiratorial consent. It was a smile of 2 men meeting accidentally in a brothel, both slightly abashed. They are at the same time glad that the feeling is mutual, and a bond of something akin to brotherhood develops between them. Their smiles were all the more complacent because he had never had the reputation of being a conformist. He supposed acceptance of the chief surgeon proposal was therefore further proof that the cowardice was slowly but surely becoming the norm of behavior, and soon ceased to be taken for what it actually was. He had never been friends with these people, and he realized with dismay that it did in fact make the statement the chief surgeon requested him, and they would start inviting him to the parties. Friends with him. The second type of reaction came from the people who themselves, their intimates, had been persecuted. He refused to compromise with the occupation powers, or were convinced that they would refuse to compromise, to sign a statement, even though no one had requested it of them, for instance, because they were too young to be seriously involved. One of the later, Dr. S., a talented young physician, asked Tomas one day, "Well, have you written it up for them?" "What in the world are you talking about?" Tomas asked in turn. "Why, your retraction," he said. There was no malice in his voice. He even smiled. One more smile from that thick herbal of smiles, the smile of a smug moral superiority. "Tell me, what do you know about my retraction?" said Tomas. "Have you read it?" "No," said S. "Then what are you babbling about?" Still smug, still smiling, S replied, "Look, we know how it goes. You incorporate it into a letter to the chief surgeon or to some minister or somebody. He promises it won't leak out and humiliate the author. Isn't that right?" Tomas shrugged his shoulders and let S go on. "But even after the statement is safely filed away, the author knows that it can't be made public at any moment. So from then on it doesn't open his mouth, never criticizes a thing, never makes the slightest protest. The first peep out of him, and into print it goes, sullying his good name far and wide. On the whole, it's a matter of nice method, and one could imagine worse." "It's a very nice method," said Tomas. "But would you mind telling me who gave you the idea?" I'd agreed to go along with it. He shrugged his shoulders. The smile did not disappear from his face, and suddenly Tomas grasped a strange fact. Everyone was smiling at him. Everyone wanted him to write the retraction. It would make everyone happy. The people with the first type of reaction would be happy because by inflating cowardice, he would make their actions seem commonplace and therefore give back their lost honor. The people with the second type of reaction would come to consider their honor a special privilege, never to be yielded, and that showed a secret love for the cowards. For them, Without them, their courage would soon erode into trivial, monotonous grind admired by no one. Tomas could not bear the smiles. He thought he saw them everywhere, even on the faces of strangers in the street. He began losing sleep. Could it be? Did he really hold these people in such high esteem? No. He had no good to say about them. He was angry with himself for letting their glances upset him so. He was completely illogical. How could someone who had so little respect for people be so dependent on what they thought of him? Perhaps his deep-seated mistrust of people, his doubts as to the right to decide his destiny and to judge him, had played its part in the choice of profession. A profession that excluded him from public display. A man who chooses to be a politician, say, voluntarily makes the public his judge, with a naive assurance that he will gain its favor, and if the crowd does express its disapproval, it merely goads him on to bigger and better things, much in the way Tomas was spurred on by the difficulty of his diagnosis. A doctor, unlike a politician or an actor, is judged only by his patients and immediate colleagues, that is, behind closed doors, man to man. Confronted by the looks of those who judge him, he can respond at once to his own look to explain or defend himself. Now, for the first time in his life, Tomas found himself in a situation where the looks fixed on him were so numerous that he was unable to register them. He could answer neither his look or with the words. He had everyone's mercy. People talked about him, inside and outside the hospital. It was a time when news who betrayed, who denounced, and who collaborated spread through nervous Prague with the uncanny speed of a bush telegraph. Although he knew about it, he could do nothing to stop it. He was surprised at how unbearable he found it, how panic-stricken it made him feel. The interest they showed him was as unpleasant as an elbowing crowd, or the pawings of the people who tear off the clothes off in nightmares. He went on to the chief surgeon and told him he could not write a word. The chief surgeon shook his head with a greater energy than usual and said he had anticipated Tomas's decision. "Perhaps you can find a way to keep me on, even without a statement," said Tomas, trying to hint that a threat by all his colleagues to resign upon his dismissal would suffice. But his colleagues never dreamed of threatening to resign, and so before long the chief surgeon shook his head even more energetically than the previous time. It was black and blue for days. He was forced to leave the hospital 5. First he went to work in a country clinic about 50 miles from Prague. He commuted daily by train and came home exhausted. A year later he managed to find a more advantageous and more inferior position at a clinic on the outskirts of Prague. There he could no longer practice surgery and became a general practitioner. The waiting room was jammed and he had scarcely 5 minutes for each patient. He told them how much aspirin to take, signed their sick leave documents, and referred them to specialists. He considered himself more civil servant than doctor. One day at the end of office hours he was visited by a man of about 50 whose portliness added to his dignity. He introduced himself as representing the Ministry of the Interior and invited Tomas to join him for a drink across the street. He ordered a bottle of wine. "I have to drive home," said Tomas by way of refusal. "If I'll lose my license if they find I've been drinking." The man from the Ministry of the Interior smiled. "If anything has happened, just show them this." And he handed Tomas a card engraved with his name, though clearly not his real name, and the telephone number of the ministry. He went into a long speech about how much he admired Tomas. The whole ministry was distressed at the thought of so respected a surgeon dispensing aspirin at an outlying clinic. It gave Tomas to understand that although he couldn't come out and say it, the police did not agree with drastic tactics like removing specialists from their posts, since no one had thought to praise Tomas in quite some time. He listened to the plump official very carefully, and he was surprised by the precision and detail, the immense knowledge of his professional career. How defenseless we are in the face of flattery. Tomas was unable to prevent himself from taking seriously what the ministry official said, but it was not out of mere vanity. More important was Tomas's lack of experience. When you sit face to face with someone who is a pleasant, respectful, polite, you have a hard time reminding yourself that nothing he says is true, that nothing is sincere. Maintaining non-belief constantly, systematically, without the slightest vacillation requires a tremendous effort and the proper training. In other words, frequent police interrogations. Tomas liked that training. The man from the ministry went on. "We know that you had an excellent position in Zurich. We very much appreciate your having returned. It was a noble deed. You realized your place was here." And then he added, as if scolding Tomas for something, "But your place is at the operating table too." "I couldn't agree more," said Tomas. There was a short pause, after which the man from the ministry said in mournful tones, "And tell me, doctor, do you really think that the communists should put out their eyes, you who have given so many people the gift of health? But that's preposterous," Tomas cried in self-defense. "Why don't you read what I wrote?" "I have read it," said the man from the ministry, in a voice that was meant to sound very sad. "Well, did I write that the communists ought to put out their eyes?" "That's not how everyone understood it," said the man from the ministry, his voice growing sadder and sadder. "If you'd read the complete version the way I wrote it originally, you wouldn't have read into it that the published version was slightly cut." "What was that?" asked the man from the ministry, picking up his ears. "You mean they didn't publish it the way you wrote it? They cut it a lot, by about a third." The man from the ministry appeared sincerely shocked. "That was very improper of them." Tomas shrugged his shoulders. "You should have protested, demanded that they set the record straight immediately. The Russians came before I had time to think about it, but we had other things to think about then. But you wouldn't want people to think that you, a doctor, wanted to deprive human beings of their right to see. Try to understand, will you? It was a letter to the editor, buried in the back pages. No one even noticed it. No one but the Russian embassy staff, because that's what they look for. Don't say that. Don't think that. I myself have talked to many people who read your article and were amazed you could have written it. But now that you tell me that it didn't come out the way you wrote it, a lot of things fall into place. Did they put you up to writing it? To writing it? No, I submitted it on my own. Do you know the people there? What people? The people who published your article? No. You mean you never spoke to them? They asked me to come in once, in person. Why? About the article, and who was it you talked to? One of the editors? What was his name? Not until that point did Tomas realize that he was under interrogation. All at once he saw that his every word could put someone in danger. Although he obviously knew the name of the editor in question, he denied it. I'm not sure. Now, said the man in a voice dripping with indignation over Tomas's insincerity. You can't tell me he didn't introduce himself. It's a tragicomic fact that your proper upbringing has become an ally of the secret police. We do not know how to lie. The tell-the-truth imperative drummed into us by our mamas and papas functions so automatically that we feel ashamed of lying even to a secret policeman. During an interrogation, it is simpler for us to argue with him or insult him, which makes no sense whatsoever, than to lie to his face, which is the only thing to do. When a man of the ministry accused him of insincerity, Tomas nearly felt guilty. He had to account of a normal barrier to be able to preserve his lie. I suppose I did introduce himself, he said. But because his name didn't ring a bell, I immediately forgot it. What did he look like? The editor who had dealt with him, a short man with a light brown crew cut. Tomas tried to choose diametrically opposed characteristics. He was tall, he said, and had long black hair. Aha, said the man from the ministry, and a big chin. That's right, said Tomas. A little stooped? That's right, said Tomas, again realizing that now the man from the ministry had pinpointed an individual. Not only had Tomas informed on some poor editor, but more important, the information he had given was false. And what did he want to see you about? What did you talk about? It had something to do with word order. It sounded like a ridiculous attempt at evasion. And again the man from the ministry waxed indignant at Tomas's refusal to tell the truth. First you tell me they cut your text by a third, then you tell me they talked to you about word order. Is that logical? This time Tomas had no trouble responding because he had told the absolute truth. It is not logical, but that's how it was, he laughed. They asked me to let them change the word order in one sentence, and then cut a third of what I had written. The man from the ministry shook his head as if unable to grasp so immoral an act. That was highly irregular on their part. He finished his wine and concluded, You have been manipulated, Dr. Hughes. It would be a pity for you and your patients to suffer as a result. We are very much aware of your positive qualities. We will see what can be done. He gave Tomas his hand and pumped it cordially. Then each went off to his own car. 6. After the talk with the man from the ministry, Tomas fell into a deep depression. How could he have gone along with the jovial tone of the conversation if he hadn't refused to have everything at all to do with the man? He was not prepared for what happened and did not know what was condoned by law and what was not. He could not have at least refused to drink wine with him when they were friends. Supposing someone had seen someone who knew the man, he could have only inferred that Tomas was working with the police. And what did he even tell him? That the article had been cut? How did he throw in that piece of information? He was extremely displeased with himself. 2 weeks later, the man from the ministry paid him another visit. One more invited him for the drink, but this time Tomas requested they stay in his office. I understand perfectly, doctor, said the man with a smile. Tomas, intrigued by his words, he said them like a chess player who is letting his opponent know that he made an error in the previous move. They sat opposite each other. Tomas at his desk after about 10 minutes, during which they talked about the flu epidemic raging at the time. The man said, We've given your case a lot of thought. If we were the only ones involved, there would be nothing to it, but we have public opinion to take into account. Whatever you meant to or not, you fell into the flames of anti-communist hysteria with your article. I must tell you there is even a proposal to take you to court for that article. There's a law against public incitement to violence. The man from the Ministry of the Interior paused to look at Tomas in the eye. Tomas shrugged his shoulders. The man assumed his comforting tone again. We voted down the proposal. No matter what your responsibility is in the affair, society has an interest in seeing you use your abilities to the utmost. The chief surgeon of your hospital speaks very highly of you. We have reports for your patients as well. You are a fine specialist. Nobody requires a doctor to understand politics. You let yourself be carried away. It's a high time we settled this thing once and for all. That's why we put together a sample statement for you. All you have to do is make it available to the press. We'll make sure it comes out in proper time. He handed Tomas a piece of paper. Tomas read what was in it and panicked. It was much worse than the chief surgeon had asked him to sign 2 years before. It did not stop the retraction of the aid of his article. It contained words of love for the Soviet Union, vows of fidelity to the Communist Party. It condemned the intelligentsia, which wanted to push the country into civil war, and above all it denounced the editors of the Writers' Weekly, with a special emphasis on the tall, stooped editor. Tomas had never seen him, though he knew his name and had seen pictures of him, which consciously distorted his article and used it for their own devices, turning into a self or counter-revolution. Too cowardly to write such an article themselves, they had hid behind a naive doctor. The man from the ministry saw the panic in Tomas's eyes. He leaned over and gave his knee a friendly pat under the table. Remember, doctor, it is only a sample. Think it over. If there is something you want to change, I'm sure we can come to an agreement. After all, it is your statement. Tomas held the paper out, and the secret policeman, as if he were afraid to keep it in his hands another second, as if he were worried someone would find his fingerprints on it. But instead of taking the paper, the man from the ministry spread his arms in the feigned amazement, the same gesture the Pope uses to bless the crowds in the balcony. Now, why do you do a thing like that, doctor? Keep it. Think it over calmly at home. Tomas took his head patiently and held the hamper in his outstretched hand. In the end, the man from the ministry was forced to abandon the papal gesture and take the paper back. Tomas was on the point of telling him emphatically that they would neither write nor sign nor text whatever. But at the last moment he changed his tone and said mildly, I'm no illiterate, am I? Why should I sign something I didn't write myself? Very London, doctor. Let's do it your way. You write it up yourself. We'll go over it together. You can use what you've just read as a model. Why didn't Tomas give the secret policeman an immediate and unconditional notice? This probably went through his head, besides using a statement like that to demoralize the nation in general, which is clearly the Russian strategy. The police could have concrete goal in his case. They could be gathering evidence for a trial against the editors of the weekly that had published Tomas's article. If that is so, then we need a statement for the hearing and the smear campaign the press would conduct against them. Were he to refuse flatly on principle, there was always the danger the police would print the prepared statement over his signature, whether he gave the consent or not. No one newspaper would dare publish his denial. No one in the world would believe that he wouldn't written or signed it. People derive too much pleasure from seeing their fellow man morally humiliated to spoil the pleasure by hearing out an explanation. By giving the police hope that they would write a text of his own, he gains a lot of time. The very next day he resigned for the clinic, assuming correctly that after he had descended voluntarily into the lowest rung of the social ladder, a deceit being made by thousands of intellectuals in other fields at the time, the police would no more hold him, and he would cease to interest in him. Once he had reached the lowest rung of the ladder, they would no longer be able to publish a statement in his name. For simple reason, no one would accept it as genuine. Emulating public statements are associated exclusively with signatories' rise, not fall, but in Tomas's country, doctors are state employees, and the state may or may not release them from its service. The official with whom Tomas negotiated with resignation, knew him by name and reputation, tried to talk him into staying on. Tomas suddenly realized he was not at all sure he had made the proper choice. He felt bound to it by then, an unspoken vow of fidelity. He stood fast, and that is how he became a window washer.